Hello, I'm Chase Blasik, an Asia-Pacific analyst at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview. Subscribe today at stratfor.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Thank you for joining us. As Russia's war in Ukraine continues, military analysts are questioning both the efficacy of the Kremlin's military strategy and the state of its forces. But will either deter Putin's plans for Ukraine? Well, here now with analysis of options Russia might have for the war in eastern Ukraine is Matthew Orr, RANE's Eurasia analyst. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, Emily. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Can we start with what analysts are saying about Russia's military right about now?
Yes, absolutely. Military analysts have basically been saying for a while now that Russia really only has the forces to conduct this current offensive in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass area, and that once this offensive kind of peters out, win, lose, or draw in that, they're going to be kind of a spent force offensively. It doesn't mean they need to, cede ground or withdraw. It just means that amid the continued weapons deliveries from the West to Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult for them to conduct further offensive operations. That's a far cry from some of the incorrect speculation that has been going on for weeks now that Russia was capable, for example, of launching a new offensive in southern Ukraine, trying to link up with the Transnistria region, the breakaway region of Moldova, or potentially capture the port city of Odessa. Those kinds of things look entirely out of the question and have for a while, really. So now the question is, does Russia have enough manpower to solidify and hold the gains that it's making in this offensive? And that's really the open question, because Russia is beginning to run into manpower issues where the Ukrainians, of course, have declared a general mobilization of their country, right? Basically putting themselves on a martial law and war footing and getting every able-bodied male age 18 to 60 who has been barred from leaving the country and has a lot of manpower to do things and to conduct this war. Russia is not. Russia has not declared war and it is still in a peacetime footing. And so as this war goes on, it's going to need more manpower. And so the question now is, where is it going to come from?
So wait, Matthew, Russia has not declared war? Remind me what it's called?
Yes. Russia's actions in Ukraine are being called a special military operation. In fact, calling the war a war is considered discrediting of the Russian armed forces and carries large penalties up to many years in prison. So in Russia, people are still being told that this is not a war. In fact, it's a special military operation to avoid a war. War, what the Russian people are being told, of course, war is what would have happened if Russia had not launched this preemptive operation. Of course, that's objectively all incorrect, but it's an important thought to keep in mind that the Russian people are very isolated from this very obvious fact that this is a war.
So let's go back to the armed forces. Is Russia actually considering war and mobilization measures?
Well, yes, they are. They absolutely are. Russia understands that it needs more manpower no matter what. And so the question is, what are its options for getting that manpower? Speculation on Russia declaring war has been speculated on, particularly in the Western media in the past week. There's been reports that Putin might even declare some kind of mobilization or declare a war on May 9th. I think that's quite unlikely, and there are several reasons for that we'll get into. But the fundamental issue is that Russia needs more manpower. And so what are its options? The first option is, as I said, declaring this war and mobilizing for a war. What would that do? That would mean that all able-bodied men in Russia over the people of conscription age would be conscripted, and then everybody over 27, usually to around 50 or 60, would be required to show up to certain locations for participation in war efforts. If this step is taken across all of Russia, it would lead to many more people than Russia necessarily needs, but more importantly, it would build this expectation that Russia is now at war. And to achieve victory in the war, there would be this expectation that victory now at this point is not what the things that Putin has been talking about more recently, just saying securing the Donbass area, but instead would presuppose Russia returning to these more maximalist war efforts of the alleged denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, and would presume that Russia is going to make a renewed attempt to seize Kiev, to install a pro-Russian government, to seize more of southern Ukraine, and that's a very unpopular and risky proposition, as many Russian people realize that they would be at extreme danger. Of course, military-aged men would look to flee the country. People would be pushed out of certain jobs into military jobs, armaments production, things of that nature, and all of that would be very negative for the Russian economy, for Putin's popularity, and very risky, because even if Russia went to all these steps, it's still not guaranteed a victory, and it is guaranteed high military losses. So I tend to think that a general mobilization and declaration of war remains very unlikely.
So if that's the case, Matt, what are his other options then?
Yeah, he has two other options. The other option would be to do nothing, to continue calling this a special military operation, and to not resort to a general mobilization to solve his manpower problem. The problem is that this is very risky, because the Ukrainians in that case will begin very dangerous counterattacks. Following this Russian offensive, Russian forces will be at their most vulnerable, because they're not yet maximally dug in to their new positions, and the Ukrainians still have the manpower advantage. So the Ukrainians would be incentivized to start counterattacking and start re-seizing, recapturing their own territory. And of course, Russia losing territory on the battlefield and then not regaining it would be a disgrace for the Russian army, and would be considered a loss. That scenario of doing nothing also comes with very high risks. And so for that reason, I think that the most likely scenario is something between the first two options. Basically, it's a third door where Putin is going to say, how do I get more manpower, but without over-mobilizing and declaring war and things like that? And so what I think that means is that he's going to do some kind of partial mobilization. Legally, it's going to be difficult to do, because the only, per Russian law, the really only type of partial mobilization that's understood is mobilization in specific regions of Russia. So Putin could, for example, mobilize people in the regions of Russia that border Ukraine. I think that's probably one of the more likely versions of this, where they basically say these regions of Russia are under danger now, and so we need to conduct mobilization in these areas and move military-aged men and other people into this war footing. Another version of this partial mobilization would be one where basically Putin, creates a new legal framework to basically selectively conscript people, essentially some sort of a draft system where the government gets broad capabilities to select people based off of certain parameters, based off of where you work, the considered importance of your job to the economy, to basically selectively force people into military or other service. And then the final version of this is one where basically, for example, at his Victory Day speech on May 9th, Putin declares some kind of new patriotic volunteer push. He puts a lot of emphasis on volunteers and said people should, as part of their patriotic duty to Russia, they should volunteer. Of course, they might try to add certain economic stimulus to that, large bonuses for signing up for the armed forces. But this also comes with a lot of risks, because if Putin throws his political weight behind this volunteer program and then it also fails on the battlefield, or fails to get enough signups, then that comes with very specific direct risks for Putin. But given the circumstances, I think some kind of partial mobilization like this is very likely.
So Matt, let me ask you something. I've been reading a lot of articles that suggest that this could, in the end, or could rapidly turn into what is essentially a proxy war between Russia and NATO. How likely is that?
Yeah, to answer that question, I think it's important to point out that that's how Russia is beginning to frame the conflict for the Russian people. They're saying, oh, the reason the special military operation is going a little bit slower than planned is that this is NATO has provided. It's really a conflict with NATO. It's just essentially a proxy conflict, because NATO is providing all of these weapons that are allowing the Ukrainians to resist so effectively. The thing is that we have the West has been providing some weapons that are really helpful to the Ukrainians. Most recently, these artillery systems, certain anti-air systems. But the prospect of the conflict escalating into a Russia-NATO confrontation, I think, is still low. I mean, there's still several kind of triggers that we would need to go through for that to happen. The first is that Russia seems to have already accepted the nature and types of support that we're giving Ukraine, the types of weapons, and has not forcefully retaliated to that. And so I think it's unlikely that they would, for example, signal some kind of major escalation or provocation, for example, raise their nuclear threat level more just because of the artillery systems that we're providing Ukraine. So there has to be some kind of incident that would cause this kind of spillover into a larger conflict with NATO. Although the longer this war goes on and the longer this stalemate on the battlefield grinds on, which appears to be the most likely scenario, is several more months of grinding conflict, this still low probability of the conflict escalating into a Russian-NATO confrontation will slowly but steadily rise as Russia feels that it might need to create some kind of escalation with NATO to justify certain measures internally to escalate the war, or an attempt to basically escalate to de-escalate, right? Russia might seek to escalate with NATO in some way precisely in order to get NATO to back down and to stop providing certain amounts of support for Ukraine and so on. So it's definitely a topic that I think we're going to be talking about constantly as Russia's war in Ukraine wages on.
Matthew Orr is RANE's Eurasia analyst, and he is an in-house expert on the situation in Ukraine. Thank you so much, Matt.
Sure thing, Emily.
You can read Matt's latest column in RANE Worldview, but you need a subscription. Lucky for you, RANE is offering 4 weeks of content for just $1. You can subscribe today and take advantage of that offer at stratfor.com. That's stratfor.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thank you for listening.